Hey guys, welcome to Odie Facts, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about Samuel Little. So, who was Samuel Little? So, he is one of America's most prolific, if not the most prolific serial killer of all times. So, between 1970 and 2005, Samuel Little allegedly murdered 93 people. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Violent Criminal Apprehension Program has confirmed Little's involvement in at least 60 of those 19 confessed murders, which is the largest number of confirmed victims in any serial killer in United States history. That means that he killed more people than Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, and Ted Bundy combined. So why do we not know his name? So Star's new true crime docuseries Confronting a Serial Killer details how Little, who died in 2020, made his way across the country over the course of decades, treating back alleys, pickup corners, and underbelly junk box joints as his hunted ground, targeting prostitutes and drug addicts, often poor women of color, strangling them to death. So his rap sheet over the years was over 100 pages long, filled with rape, assault, even murder. He was tried 3 times, but despite witness testimony from survivors, he was repeatedly acquitted and spent little to no time in jail. It wasn't until DNA evidence linked him to murders of 3 women in 2012 that he was finally convicted, though he still maintained his innocence. And it wasn't until art and journalist Julian Lauren began looking into his story, developing a relationship that evolved into almost daily phone calls from prison, that Little confessed in graphic, disturbing details of these murders. So, in our system of justice, not only are perpetrators treated terribly in terms of racial equality, but if the victim of violent crimes are from a more marginalized community, people of color, women in general, sex workers, people with drug issues, they're not treated the same. Director Joe Berlinger says, to Daily Beast. Their families aren't even looking for them. So how did Little literally get away with murders for so long? His victims were, as Lauren explained in the series, considered less dead by authorities and the judicial system. Their tragedies discounted because of their race, status, and life choices, says Bullinger. If a white female from Yale University was killed, that crime would have been treated very, very differently than any of the victims of Samuel Little, which is a fact. So Confronting a Serial Killer tracks how Lauren earns Little's trust. Through her recordings of their phone conversations, you hear him boast with a disturbing photographic memory of the details of his stranglings and the fetish pleasure he took from them. She then investigates how, even when those murders were reported and survivors testified against him, detectives, lawyers, and juries neglected the cases and miscarried justice, often because the victims were deemed to be of low character or disposable. Crazy. That's definitely crazy. They don't believe you even though you survived, right? Confessing he tried to kill you. So what do we know about Samuel Little's early life? Not much is known about his early life. We know that he was born as Samuel McDowell on June 7, 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia, to 16-year-old prostitute Bessie Mae Little and 19-year-old client Paul McDowell. Soon after his birth, Little's family moved to Lorain, Ohio, where he was brought up mainly by his grandmother because his mother could not care for him. Little ended up with 47 disciplinary reports in the year he was there. He attended Hawthorne Junior High School, where he had problems with discipline and achievement. By his own account, he began having sexual fantasies about strangling women as a child, stating when he saw his kindergarten teacher touch her neck as a teenager, he collected true crime magazines depicting women being choked. Crazy. So throughout his early life, he was a drifter who lacked a strong connection with any people or places. He had tumultuous childhood abandonment issues because of his mother. He was raised by his grandma. The only recurring connection in his life was a longtime girlfriend, Jean, who died. He was raised mostly by his grandma in Ohio, and it didn't take long for him to commit to a life of crime. At 16, Little went to and spend some time in juvenile detention center after being convicted of breaking and entering. After serving time, he dropped out of high school and moved to Florida with his mom in the late 1960s, working at various times as a cemetery worker and an ambulance attendant. So he said he had begun traveling more widely and had more run-ins with the law, being arrested in 8 states for crimes that included driving under the influence, fraud, shoplifting, solicitation, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and rape. Little claimed that he took up boxing during his time in prison, referring to himself as a former prize fighter. Little told Texas Ranger in his 2018 confession that he had fantasized about killing women from a young age. He was always focused on women's necks, even pinning the image of women who had been strangled to death on his wall. When he did marry or have girlfriends, he said that he would try to avoid looking at their necks because he didn't want to strangle them. Not much else is known about his younger life other than the fact that he was in and out of prison a lot and then he boxed. By the time he was 35, he had been arrested 26 times. He had spent at least 3 years in prison for one sentence after breaking into a furniture store. Reports say that Little had a habit of robbing people for drugs and alcohol money, blowing it, and then moving on to the next place. Little's supposedly first murder took place in 1970. He confessed to up to 93 murders over a span of 30 years, but due to time in between the actual murder and the confessions, not all of these murders have been identified or confirmed. Only 60 have. So, let's talk a little bit about the victims, because this is interesting. Our first victim, we have Mary Jo Brosley. What we know is there was a pattern born from her. Little would follow throughout his life. Brosley was an alcoholic who was estranged from her family. She had a 7-year-old son in 1970 whom she abandoned, and she moved from Massachusetts to Florida. Her family reported her missing 2 days after she left, not knowing she had ended up with Little until 45 years later. Brosley met Little in a bar and he strangled her to death. Her body was found in a shallow grave, but her remains were not identified until 2017. A year later, Little confessed to her murder. He knew a surprising amount of details for someone who committed up to 92 murders. After her, he knew what she was wearing, remembered complications regarding burying her body, and also she had problems with alcohol. This was a pattern for Little. He tended to kill women who had substance abuse problems or ran into trouble with the law because it was easier for Little to get away with these crimes. He believed that to some degree people weren't going to go looking for these women, and he was right. Although Mary Jo Brosley's shallow grave made it obviously clear to law enforcement that someone was involved in her murder, other cases weren't so obvious. Many victims were not even identified as murder victims for decades. Law enforcement believed that these women had died of an overdose or accidental death. To this day, many victims probably wouldn't have been linked to Little if it weren't for his confessions right off rip. Just building that relationship, talking to him. So victims between years of 1970 and 1982. But his confessions over 50 years after his first murder, Little continued his murder spree, killing allegedly 24 women between 1970 and 1982. In 1982, he was charged with the murder of 22-year-old Melinda Mindy Lepre, but he was not indicted. During this time, he was also charged with the murder of 26-year-old Patricia Ann Mount. In both cases, eyewitnesses testified and linked Little to the victims. The testimony, however, came from sex workers. The jury did not trust these accounts, and without any physical evidence to link Little to the murders, he was not convicted. In most of his murders, Little punched and strangled his victims to death. DNA was not used to link serial killers to their victims. It wasn't until later in the 1980s. So Little was able to evade even though the closest run-ins with law enforcement and grand juries for decades because they weren't testing DNA yet. So quickly after he was released in 1984, Little struck again. He was arrested twice in less than 2 months for strangling a woman in California. Although he was convicted for these crimes, he was still not linked to any previous murder. He served only 2.5 years in prison, and he was released in 1987 and moved to Los Angeles. In Los Angeles alone, he killed another 10 women before traveling the country again. Over the next 10 years, he would commit murders that took place in Florida, Georgia, Kansas, Louisiana, Nevada, Ohio, and Arizona. According to Little's later confession, he continued killing until 2005. How did Little get caught then? So, in 2012, Samuel Little was in Kentucky. He was arrested on a narcotics charge while living in a homeless shelter. By this time, collecting your DNA evidence in criminal cases was commonplace. So Little's DNA was linked to multiple murders that was, done in the 1980s. All 3 victims have been found on the streets in Los Angeles after they were killed. This was much more than just a drug charge. Little was extradited into jail in California, and then he was charged with the murder of those 3 women because he was linked through DNA. And all of a sudden, investigators had a lead on dozens of murder cases between 1970 to 1990s. The LaPree case was also reopened after he was charged. So this is when they started finding stuff out. With more physical evidence against him, Little was finally convicted for murder in 2014. He originally pleaded not guilty and claimed he was innocent. Little was sentenced to 3-year sentence without possibility of parole. That's just 3 years. So Samuel's little confession. Let's figure this out. So not much news came surrounding Samuel's little murders until he began to confess the murders in 2018, which is crazy. Many detectives, sheriff, and other members of law enforcement tried to get information out of Little from the time he was sent to prison for life. But all of them failed until James Johnny Holland came along. James Holland is a Texas Ranger who heard about the case in 2017 that wasn't Holland's first rodeo. He had many years of experience as a Texas Ranger, the official title for the group of around 100 Texas detectives who handle the state's most serious crimes. Little had killed Denise Christie brothers in Odessa, Texas in 1994. He was later charged with her murder and pleaded guilty to this particular crime. Holland is known as a serial killer whisperer of sorts, so it made sense that he would go in and talk to Little. With the help of FBI's Violent Crime Apprehension Program, Holland was able to talk to Little about various cases that did take place throughout the country, but he did not get a confession at first. He carefully stated when he started talking to Little, being sure to use to be cautious while talking to him about strangulation, rape, and other crimes that Little had been accused of committing over the years. The first time they met, Holland told Little he was at the prison just for a visit. The interrogation lasted 2.5 hours, and that time Little grew a liking for Holland. They bonded over spending time in Texas, sodas they linked, and nicknames that their parents had given them. Holland listened to Little as he vented about the local police and was patient as Little started to tell the truth about certain details surrounding one of his alleged murders. By the time the interview was over, Little had told Holland that he had stopped counting the amount of murders he had committed at 84. The next day, Holland went back in for another 4-hour interrogation, and this continued both in California and in Texas after Little was extradited. There was a stand trial for killing of the Denise Christie brothers. Over the course of a few months, Holland got more and more details about the killings, giving the information to his team as they tried to link the details to the murders over, the past decades. So, sketches of Samuel's Little's victims. So this freaked me out the most. So parts of why these cases were starting to close were because while he didn't remember everything, Little remembered so much about so many of his victims. He drew sketches of them for Holland. Over 20 sketches in total. Little knew the clothes they wore, how he met them, and even details of the conversations they had before he strangled them. He confessed that many of these women had been sex workers or were unlikely to be missed by family or friends who would have been searching for him, or trying to get any local media attention to find help to find these ladies. So as little confessions were being linked to various crimes, sheriff all over the whole country were making announcements that Little were involved in cases that hadn't been solved for 20 plus years, and these confessions shed light on some counties who had unidentified victims, bringing closure to investigators or family members because their loved ones were learning about their family members' murders decades later. So the FBI continued to ask people to help them as they linked Little's confession to any disappearance over the past decades. And that's basically it. So, how did Samuel Little die? So, in 2020, Samuel Little died in a hospital in Los Angeles. An exact cause of death was not determined, although no foul play was suspected. Little had suffered from diabetes for a long time and had a heart trouble. He was 80 years old. In a bizarre, twisted sense of fate, had Little died one day later, he would have died 50 years after his first murder. To this day, FBI are still working to connect Samuel's Little confessions to various killings throughout the United States. It's almost strange that people don't know the story of Samuel Little, as well as, figures like John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy. Maybe this is because Little's confessions came so much later than Gacy or Bundy. Maybe it's because the deeper investigation into crimes only happened after he had confessed. Unlike Ted Bundy, college-age woman, Gacy's young men, the victims of Little didn't gain as much media attention or make national news. Whatever the reason is, you now know quite a bit more about the most prolific serial killer in recent American history. Yep, Samuel Little. So please like, subscribe. Let me know who else you want to learn about, and I will be posting more.